Hello, and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month we're going to take a look at landscapes. No water involved, no cities involved, a few small buildings, but mostly we're painting sky and flower with a nice retreating path that is going to help us to work on our perspective drawing a little bit. So let's get started. Print out your reference material onto a piece of paper with margins around the outside so that you can write. And then if you want, you can put down a really simple grid system just to help you in the placement of some of these objects. So I just divided my length into half and then quarters and did the same thing with my width. Just so I have 4 marks, top and bottom. Then I'm going to go to my drawing or my painting paper. I like to use Arches 140-pound cold pressed paper. And I'm just going to tape off a rectangle that's the same dimensions, but it doesn't have to be exact. So I'm not even going to take the time to measure. So next, I'm going to draw. I'm just going to use a 2H pencil or an HB, doesn't really matter. So this is my quarter mark that corresponds with this quarter mark, so I know that my horizon line is going to have to go below it. It's easier to make it exactly straight because then I can always mess around with it in the tree line a little bit to break it up and make it look more natural. But if I start with a wonky curving down horizon line, my whole painting is going to fall apart. Then I'm going to put in this path. So I know that this end matches up with about the halfway mark, and this end is actually not even on the horizontal axis here. It goes up to the half point. It's really small. It needs to curve a little more. And so I'm using my exterior grid to help me to plot out the basic key points. Like how high does it go up? How big should it be at the bottom? But then I am eyeballing to get the rest. So I get my large shapes in place with the grid, and then I make changes just based on what I see. Okay, so all I'm going to do to finish my sketch is straighten up my lines in my houses. Just decide how exact you want those to be, and then put them in with a ruler once you have them all cleaned up. So let me take this off screen a little bit and clean up my houses. Then my sketch will be ready, and I'll show you how to prepare it, how to protect those whites, and then we'll be ready to paint. Alright, let's pan in a little bit here, because what I'm going to do next is use some masking fluid to protect the things that I want kept white. So that includes this really white house. I'm going to protect all the houses actually, and then these foreground white flowers. They're the most important part. So I'm going to use a masking pen to do that. This is what that looks like. It's a little squeeze bottle with a needle so that you can get a nice fine line. It's all filled with masking fluid. So I've got my needle, and then I'm just going to fill in these small delicate shapes. Make sure that you use plenty of masking fluid. And if your needle clogs like mine is done, you can still just dip the needle into a little puddle of masking fluid and paint with it like this. But then you can use a pencil or anything, the back of it, and fill in a little bit more quickly. So you need to work quickly enough that it doesn't start to dry on you. So that's how you fill in the houses. I'll do the same thing with this third house, but let me also show you how I would fill in the flowers in the foreground. So what you need to do there is protect your paper, because the spattering method is always less controlled. So I'm going to protect everywhere on the paper that I don't want the spatters to go. Then you can use a toothbrush or a nylon brush, and then I'm just going to flick on some masking fluid like this. This makes a very small speckly pattern, so I can also try tapping. Just get plenty of masking fluid on the brush and just go to town like this. In the foreground, I'm going to dip my little needle tool in and just do a few of these by hand, just like this. Don't make them too round and regular, and keep in mind that the flowers are all growing at different angles, so they shouldn't all look the same, and they shouldn't be tilted at the same angle either. So then I'll put a few more speckles on and finish that house, and then we'll come back when the masking fluid is dry. All right, masking fluid is dry and it is time to start painting. So, a couple things before we get started. Number one, get some test pieces of paper, of watercolor paper, nearby so that you can do some color matching. I like to use a square punch so that I can put it right up next to the painting and see if the color that I've mixed up matches. Number two, you're always going to work from the top down and from back to front. You do that because you don't want your painting to look like the trees were painted around the sky. The sky is there first, the trees are on top. So you work up your painting in layers. In watercolor painting, there are two basic principles. Number one, when you paint onto dry paper, you have clear, controlled lines. And when you paint onto wet paper, or wet on wet, those lines get cloudy and blurry. Both are necessary for every painting. You want some lost lines, that's going to mean painting on wet paper. You want some precise lines, that means dry paper. And with that, really, you can do everything that you want to in watercolor. The secret is mastering the amounts of dryness and wetness. So, back to front, top to bottom, the first thing we need to do is mix up a color to match this sky. I'm going to start to mix up an Antwerp blue mixed with some ultramarine and see how close I can get to that first sky. It needs to be a lot darker. One more thing, watercolor will dry lighter than it looks when you put it down. 2 or 3 shades. So if your color is really watery, you're going to lose a lot of that color intensity. I have my color worked out here, and I'm going to start in this dark corner and just brush across. Brush across. Brush across one more time. Rinse out my color. So I have a clean brush now. Slightly wet, not incredibly wet. And before this has a chance to dry, I'm going to paint the bottom edge with some clean water. See how that gives me my gradation? Then I have that salmon-y color I want to keep that. So I'm going to start with that on this corner, right over the trees. Get that salmon-y color as far across as I want it to be. Then rinse out my color again. So now I have another clean, damp brush. And I'm just going to join them right like this. And then a little bit more painting clean water just to get rid of the stripiness. It's always best to put your sky down and just let it dry. The more you overwork it, the less natural it's going to look. But that salmon-y color is staining a little bit, so I'm going to tilt it up towards the blue and put down one last pass of the wet wash. Then I'm going to let it dry. Alright, our sky is nice and dry and beautiful now. And I bet you think I forgot about those clouds, but I didn't. When you have something like this, where a white streak interrupts a nice solid gradation, it's no good trying to do that while the paint is wet. You need to pull it out after that first layer has dried. So I'm going to pull it out with a flat, angled craft brush. But I just get it wet, get rid of the excess water, and then you can rub just like this. Blot to make it even brighter. And then here's that second little shape. Done. Boom. That's how you do that. Now let's move down to the mountain range in the background. So it's a dark blue. We're going to match our color. So I'm mixing up a dark blue. It's really intense. So I have a similar blue to the sky color, but then I'm adding in a little bit of Payne's gray. So I start seeing it right here by this tree line, so that's where I'm going to add it on my painting as well. And the paper is dry, so I know that I'm going to have good control and clean lines. I'm going to keep the bottom edge nice and flat. That's why I'm using a flat brush. And then we're just going over the top like this. And some areas are going to be interrupted because that's where the green trees grow. I'm just dropping in plenty of color. And then another trick for making interesting watercolor paintings is you need a variation in color and contrast. So we're going to get that variation in contrast easily by just doing a little blot here and there, then leave it be. Just blot the bottom and leave it be, blot the bottom there, and you get some variations in color by just dropping in some different colors. So the color I will drop in here will be maybe just a hint of the green, because it's going to start moving down to green. So I'm not painting everywhere, but while the color is still just a tad wet, I'm dropping in some greens. And then maybe a slightly different shade of blue. I know, and you thought it was just going to be one blue stripe. It's not. It's more complicated than that. All right, you put it down and you leave it alone. We're going to leave it to dry. Oh, but one more thing, just to speed up the process a little bit. This color doesn't touch this color at all, so I can go ahead and put that in because it goes underneath the grasses too. So I need to have that path in before I can lay down my grasses. So I'll just quickly get something on here, keeping it broken so that there are some areas where the different colors can layer over the top and still show through. So I'm keeping that nice and light. And then, of course, we're going to drop in some color variations. So I have something a little bit more brown. I'm going to drop in here while it's still wet. I'm going to have stronger contrast in the foreground, and then let it just retreat to be lighter colored in the background. And some little lines like dirt coming up and going into the grass here and there. All right, that is fantastic. That's all we're going to do. Now let it dry again. All right, our path is dry, our sky is dry, the mountains are dry, so let's push forward and do these dark trees in the very background. For the trees, I'm going to switch to a round and just mix up some darks. It doesn't really matter what colors you use as long as they're not black. So I'm going with some greens and purples and making a nice gray that way. But to sponge on these trees so that I get some of that interesting broken around the top that looks like branches from a distance, I'm going to use a small brush, a round brush, and just boing, 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 boing like this. And it will kind of naturally develop that pattern that I'm going for. Don't overpaint in watercolor. It's one of the hardest lessons, actually. Is that a lot of times your paintings come out best when you've painted them and you've actually touched a paintbrush to the page as little as possible. And remember the power of blotting to get some different textures going. Just livens things up. I'm also going to mix in some different colors. So here I've got some purple, and I'll just dot that in here and there. And then over here we have a greenish tree that looks a little bit more green. That looks good, so we'll leave it there. Okay, everything is looking really good. So now it's time to start putting in these light, bright yellows in the background. So I'm going to put those yellows in first, starting in the background with this stripe, and then we'll do these front stripes next. First step is mixing up that color. And these yellows are almost cartoonishly bright. So that is a straight Winsor yellow, and that is almost exactly what I see here. So in the background, I'm going to add a little bit of water to dilute that color. And we'll start there, filling in this stripe of yellow. And I'm just going to go straight over the trees and everything. Not worrying about the houses because they're protected. And then I've got sort of these highlights on trees back here. So I'm just going to drop in a few light areas, and after it's dried, I can shape them up a little bit better with that darker green. All right, that's great. Let's move forward in the picture plane. I'm working dry brush because notice how when I use a dry brush on dry paper, I get this nice rough texture that kind of pops through. That's because the cold pressed paper is just a little bit textured, and it lends itself well to areas like this. It's going to be perfect for these grassy areas because I want it to look like this isn't just solid mass of color, it's flowers growing between grasses. I'll do the same thing on this side. But then see, there's going to be these yellow plants and then this colorful stripe right back here. I'll stipple, that's this bouncing movement, and just drop in some of the looser textures that way. That's working really well. So I'll go ahead and let that dry. When that's dry, we're going to do the same sort of thing, but with the green. And I also want to get this weird purple color in the background there. So let's sort of do all three of those in this stage. So I've got some purple back in here, and then it's coming right over to the edge of this yellow, and I'm just looking at my reference material really closely to see where the purple needs to go. Break up your lines with stippling so that it doesn't look too much like a painted line. Instead, it looks more organic. And then of course in the foreground here, so I'm going to do this stippled area first, and sometimes I'll break in with purples and sometimes some pinks, so that looks pretty great. And then the greens are just going to go around those yellows. So I'll start in the background. I have this green stripe right back here, and come up and do some of it in the foreground as well. And you're just dropping in those greens as you see them on the reference material, and you're stippling them around the yellows so that you don't cover up too many of the yellows, but you're trying to make these two colors mix and look like the one is growing along with the other. I'll go to my 1-inch flat here, and I'll just quickly slice in. And see, I can still work with really small areas. I'm just slicing in using just the edge of the brush and the corner of the brush, not all of the flat area. You can stipple with the flat brush, you do get a different effect and make it a more vibrant green when I move closer to the front. And I'm just adding in some different colors as I go so it's not too flat. So I'm adding some blues and some yellows to change the look of the green a little bit. I'm not going to do all the work that I need to for the greens at this stage. I'm just getting in a base color. I know my whites are protected. I also need to put in some purples though. So I need to make sure that the greens that are covering this field aren't going to cover too many of those purple colors. And then I will stipple in a more yellow version of the green. And now these colors are sort of tying together and making the overall look more interesting and more integrated. Good, so I have plenty of white space left, and that's what I'm going to use once it dries to start adding in some of those really bright purples. But I also have enough of the vivid green here and in the path. See, I'm just looking for this shape of the vivid green. So I'm putting that down as a big wet wash. Okay, let's let that dry. Welcome back. This is all dry now, and it's time to start sprinkling in some of these vibrant flowers in the foreground. So we're going to have some fun doing that. I'm going to teach you how to do a spatter technique. And the first thing that you need to do is protect everything that you don't want spattered. There we go. Then mix up a puddle of this magenta color, this one, and mix up more than you think you're going to need. I'm going to get out a size 10 round, or even a 12 round, plus a color next to it that will complement and be really similar but not exactly the same. Now, see how the patterns fall? It's more clustered back here at about the halfway point. Then there's a small patch here, and then just a little bit of dotting right in here. So I'm going to load up my brush with that nice wet color, and I'm just going to hold my hand like this, like I'm doing a chop, and I'm going to chop my brush against my fingers like this. See how that gives me kind of exactly the pattern that I'm looking for? Don't go too crazy because you want it to look like flowers. And I'm going to change up my color, do the same thing but with some more oranges. Okay, so I'm trying to get kind of an even but light spackling in the front, and then in the back I'm going to change colors again. I'm going to go to some alizarin crimson and some pinks, and I'm going to focus more with shorter chops and faster so that those sprinkles are going to land a little bit closer together. So spattering is just a little bit more involved than you might think. You need to learn how to control approximately how large your dots are going to be, how close together, and how small the drops are. So then, I'm not done yet because this just looks like a bunch of dots, which is good but also not quite what I want. So I'm going to use a spritz bottle. This is my spritz bottle. It is a recycled Suave Kids hair detangler bottle, but when I spray it on my hand I get a nice even mist. I'm going to stand about 6 inches from the surface of the paper and just do a little sprinkle. You've got to be careful. You don't want to over sprinkle. But see how it makes some of those just bloom to life? You're not drowning the paper, you're not drowning your flowers, but you're giving it just a little bit more interest and variety. Alright, now I'm going to take a small round and I'm just going to add with my bright pink, just going to go in while some of the water is still on the page, and by hand I'm going to improve the shape of some of those dots. Or if I need more, I can do a few of them by hand so that I have the most control of all. I can't do this for everything though. For one thing, it's too time consuming, but more importantly, it doesn't give you as good results. And then I didn't really get enough of a random look right here for that patch, so I'm going to put that in with my little round as well. Also, as I extend this flower patch up and make these little spikes and some of these smaller little things around here, I'm going to blot out just a bit up here so that I get some more tonal variation again. And then I'm going to add some back in. Then I get a nice organic look, and the variety and the size of these droplets and the colors and the placement are going to come all together and help it look like flowers. Okay, so let me work on these flowers this way for just a little bit. I'm going to give it about 10 minutes off camera, let it dry, and I'll come back to you. Okay, the flowers aren't quite dry yet. I sponged on some more color, and now I'm going to sponge some green into the path. So the first thing you want to do when you're using the sponge is get a large area of the paint wet on your palette, just ready to go. I'm using this kind of a sponge because it has a lot of corners and small areas, but some good texture in there as well. And then I'm just going to blot up the color on my palette. I'm just sort of pinching it into an area that I can control more easily. And I'm going to use it on the edge and rotate the edge around and just sponge some texture into the path. I'm working from the grass And I'm going into the dirt road. While I've got that dark green, I'm also going to sponge some more darks into the grass areas. Gives me a little bit more variety. And I'll just sponge some around some of these flowers as well. Alright, that's about all we can do. I could go in with my brush a little bit right now and just show you how you can clean up those grassy areas. Just have a small round. I'm going to pull my reference material close and make a few of these shapes just a little bit more deliberate looking. So I'm going to draw a few little grassy patches in these clumps on the path. I'm just going to do that up and down the path, making sure that I have the most detail in the foreground, and then as I go into the background, the patches don't have any visible blades anymore because you can't see grass when it's this far away. So when you're done texturing the grass on the path, let me just drop in a bit more details in these trees. These background trees, I'll just use my small round while I've got it. I want those to be nice and dark so that they stand out from the rest of the path. See how dark they are in the reference material? They need to be that dark. So I'll just quickly drop in some of these tree shapes with a Payne's gray mixed with some olive green. So when those trees are done, then go ahead and let it dry. The flowers are dry now, and it's time to remove the masking fluid. I'll just use a rubber cement eraser, take it off the houses. And you can see that those lines have stayed nice and straight. And then just feel with your finger and remove the masking fluid all over the sheet. All right, that is very good. So once that is done, you can use a small round and put the centers in, and that helps you to keep track of where you need to go for the petals. You're going to work primarily in the foreground. I'm just choosing a few of these to accent with a yellow center. And then after a certain level in the painting, I'm not going to do any more centers because you wouldn't be able to see them. So after about here, you won't see any more centers. So I'll do some of that off camera, and then at the same time I'm going to be going into the foreground and making these stems. See how the stems are light and the background around them is really dark? That means you can do it in one of two ways. You can protect the stem with masking fluid and then let it dry and paint a dark color over the top, or you can paint the dark color around the light stem. Take my masking fluid, same way that I did before, and I'm going to be working in only very small areas so that I don't have to spend a lot of time remasking those white flowers again. Got my masking fluid, and then I'm just going to paint some flower stems. And then in addition to stems, we also have some grasses, so you can put those in the same way. Okay, I've protected some of those stem shapes with the masking fluid. So now we can look and see what happens when we paint over it with a small round brush. I'm going to use a really dark. So this is Payne's gray and some green. So it will look like shadows in the grass. And then I'm going to keep the reference material close because I don't want to cover up all of my greens, and I certainly don't want to cover up those white flowers. But I'm just going around and making sure that I get those darks popping out. So I do need to put down enough so that the contrasts will be there. And not just this one color either. You also need to go in with some different colors of green. I can use some yellows. And I'm just going around the flowers and I'm getting these grass shapes down. See? It's very cool. And the good part about doing it this way is that when you remove the masking fluid, it looks very nice and even. And if you paint the individual blacks, which is your other option, sometimes they can start to dry and look a little bit uneven. So let me just finish putting in these darks, and then I'll come back to you and we'll take the masking fluid off. Alright, when you have put down the darks and the masking fluid and the paint is all dry, then you can remove that masking fluid. I'm just going to use a rubber cement eraser again. Just run your other hand over the surface and you can feel any masking fluid that you might have missed. Nice, and it pops out and it looks really, really cool. So that's great. Let's do a little bit of work in the houses. Very straightforward. These houses are just blue roofs, or dark roofs, and then a little bit of red and some really precise windows. So the only important thing to remember, number one, match your colors. That does make a difference. And the other thing is that you want to be really precise with those man-made shapes. So when you have windows and doors and the sides of the house and the roof, keep those as precise as you possibly can. If you can't do it freehanding, then just tape your lines off. Use masking tape. And here I can see just a little bit of a scalloped edge, like this is a tin roof. Gently, gently moving my brush up and down, and then I can quickly fill in. Just take your time around the lines, and then you can fill in the inside. And I'm not even going to change colors, I'm just going to get my brush more wet, dilute the color that's already on there, and then move on over to this side. So then I get an interesting gradation. Looks nice and varied. And I can go back in and add a little bit more dark to the shadow side before it dries. And then it will just sort of naturally bleed over and there's nothing else I need to do on it. This roof over here is even darker, so I'm going to get more Payne's Gray on the brush and just paint it the same way. Really close, delicate, careful line work. So you can see, hopefully, that it's just much more effective when you have colors mixing together on the page than one flat color. Very carefully, I'm going to do the lines on this house. I'm using a small round and paying close attention to the reference material. And let me show you how to tape in case you decide that you want to make those as precise as possible. Get some masking tape. I just need a small piece and then I'm going to split it in half. I'm going to lay it down and tamp it down with my fingernail. Then I can paint right up to the tape. And you don't even have to wait for it to dry. When it's small like this especially, you can just peel it right off. And it looks just great. Do the same thing for the windows. I'll lay the tape across the top. And then I'm going to go in with my small round and paint those windows. So I just taped the two corners, but just having a little bit of help goes a long way. Okay, so I'm going to finish tape painting my houses off camera because it's just putting in time that you've already seen. And then I'll come back and we will finish working on the flowers. I'm satisfied with the way the houses look, so I think we're going to finish it up. And to do that, I'm just going to use this product. It's called Pro White. I'm going to put a little bit in a cup, get my reference material nice and close, and then here and there, it's going to be especially effective in the darkest areas. I'm going to touch in and just polish up those flowers. Now you might be asking, why didn't you just paint them at the end instead of protecting them from the beginning? And the answer to that is that even though I like this product a lot, it's still not as effective as just pure white paper. That fresh, unscrubbed, untouched paper is always going to look cleaner and more professional than white paint or Pro White or Aqua Cover or any other product. I only rely on it for the details, and even then I only rely on it for a few details in the foreground. I don't want to go painting entire flowers with Pro White. It's never going to blend in quite as well. But if you need to bring back an edge, a small highlight, a flower petal here and there, it can make a big difference, and it can mean the difference between a good painting and a great one. Okay, and then in the grass in the foreground here, I'm just going to develop a few little blades. Just a few. A little goes a long way. And remember, always, 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 focus your efforts in the foreground. And don't forget to stop at a reasonable distance. You're not going to be able to see grass blades clear back here. And don't do too many. That might be enough right there. And then, for the most part, this is a finished painting. At least that's as far as we're going to push it today. You can always go back in, polish things up, pull out more little highlights, do the finicky work. But I'm satisfied with the way it looks now. It holds together. The path looks like it's retreating to the houses just the way I wanted it to. Having said that though, this could be a little bit cleaner back here. So I'm just going to pull out a bit more of a line. I'm just using clean water on an angled shader brush. This is just an angled flat. Clean that up a little bit more and done. Okay, so then all you're going to do is remove your tape. And once you've taken the tape off, you can see how it looks with a nice clean white boundary around it. Sometimes that changes things. The borders help to make your whites look brighter, and it looks more finished, but it also will help you to see any flaws that might be there. So what I usually do at this stage is put the painting away, don't take it off the board, let it sit for a couple of days, then come back to it with fresh eyes and do any final details and cleanup that you want to at that time. You should be able to get a sense of there being a definite foreground with details and a middle ground and then a background where you can't see so much. It should hold the viewer's eye and have enough going on that it pulls you in and keeps you there while your eye explores every square inch of the painting. So it turned out well. It's a fun one to paint. I encourage you to download the reference material, print it out, and try your own hand at this landscape. There are a lot of skills that it will teach you that you can use not only in this painting, but in many, many other paintings that you'll be painting in the future. So best of luck to you, and of course, thank you so much for watching.